Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. You ready to explore some fascinating psychology today?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
We're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of Ivan Pavlov and classical conditioning.
Oh, yeah, Pavlov. That's the
Yeah,
one with the drilling dogs, right?
that's the one, but there's so much more to it than just that. Our source material for this deep dive is actually an excerpt from a psychology textbook.
A textbook, huh? So we're going full academic today.
We'll try to keep it fun and interesting, I promise. We're going to uncover some really surprising ways this basic principle shows up in your everyday life.
Okay, you've got me intrigued. I'm ready to go beyond the drooling dogs. What else is there?
Well, first of all, did you know that Pavlov didn't even start out as a psychologist?
Really? I didn't know that. What was his background?
He was a physiologist, actually, studying digestion. He even won a Nobel Prize for his work in that field.
Wow. So how did he end up making such a big impact in psychology?
It's a pretty amazing story. He was doing all these experiments with dogs, studying their digestive systems.
Okay, I can see where the drool comes in now.
Exactly. He was observing these dogs in his lab, and he noticed something strange. They would start salivating before the food was even presented.
Huh. That is weird. So it wasn't just the taste of the food that was making them drool.
Right. It was like they knew the food was coming and their bodies were getting ready.
So that's when the light bulb went off for him, I guess.
Pretty much. That's when he shifted gears from pure biology into the world of psychology. This was a pretty big deal at the time because psychology was still a relatively new and kind of shaky field.
I can imagine. So what was causing those dogs to drool before they even got a taste of the food?
That's where the distinction between unconditioned and conditioned reflexes comes in.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, unconditioned reflexes, those are the inborn automatic ones, the kind of reactions you don't have to learn.
Like pulling your hand away from a hot stove?
Exactly.
Right.
Or like how you jump if you hear a sudden loud noise.
Okay, that makes sense. Those are like hardwired responses.
Right. Now, conditioned reflexes, those are the learned ones. They develop through experience.
Okay, so can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine you had a really bad experience at the dentist's office.
Oh, I don't even have to imagine that. Unfortunately, I know exactly what you mean.
So now every time you smell that particular dentist office smell, you might start to feel anxious or even feel your teeth hurt.
Ugh, don't even say that. It's so true, though. That smell just triggers all those bad memories.
And that's a conditioned reflex. Your brain has learned to associate that smell with discomfort.
So it's like those dogs in Pavlov's lab. They weren't born knowing that a bell meant food was coming.
Right. They learn that association through repeated pairings of the bell with the food.
So the bell became a trigger for them.
Right.
Even though a bell doesn't naturally make a dog drool,
Right.
they learn to associate it with something yummy.
Exactly. And Pavlov called that a conditioned stimulus.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get this. So we've got unconditioned reflexes, which are automatic, and then we've got conditioned reflexes, which are learned. But how does that learning actually happen? Can you break down the process a little more?
Sure. Let's take a closer look at Pavlov's experiment. He started with a neutral stimulus, something that didn't initially cause any particular response in the dogs. In his case, he used the sound of a metronome ticking.
So like a little ticking clock.
Exactly. At first, the ticking sound meant nothing to the dogs. It was just neutral.
Okay. And then he brought in the food.
Right. The food was what he called the unconditioned stimulus. It's the thing that automatically triggers a natural response. And for dogs, food naturally makes them salivate.
So the food is the trigger, and the drooling is the unconditioned response.
You got it. Now here's the key. He would repeatedly pair that neutral stimulus, the ticking metronome, with the unconditioned stimulus, the food. So he'd start the metronome ticking and then present the food. And he did this over and over again.
So he was basically training the dogs to associate those two things together.
Precisely. And something amazing happened. Through those repeated pairings, the neutral stimulus, the metronome ticking, started to transform.
What do you mean transform?
It became what Pavlov called a conditioned stimulus. It actually gained the power to trigger that drooling response all on its own.
Wow, so even without the food being there, just the sound of the metronome would make those dogs start drooling.
Exactly.
Mhm.
They had learned that the ticking sound meant food was on its way.
Pretty incredible when you think about it. And this isn't just some cool trick with dogs, right? This is happening in our own brains all the time.
You got it. This process of classical conditioning is constantly shaping how we learn, react, and even form our preferences.
Okay. So it's not just about drooling. It's affecting our emotions, our behaviors, our whole experience of the world.
Exactly. We're going to dive into some really fascinating examples of that in the next part of our deep dive. But before we go, there's a fun little experiment you can actually try yourself to see this conditioning in action.
Oh, I love a good experiment. Tell me more.
It's called the pupil dilation experiment. Have you ever heard of it?
I haven't, but the name sounds intriguing.
It's really simple. All you need is a bell, a mirror, and a room you can make totally dark.
Okay, I'm listening.
Now think about what happens to your pupils when you go into a dark room.
They get bigger, right?
Exactly. That's because your pupils dilating is an unconditioned reflex. It's your body's natural automatic response to low light.
Okay, I'm following so far. So pupils dilating in the dark, that's the unconditioned response. But where does the bell come in?
That's where the conditioning part comes in. You're going to repeatedly pair the sound of the bell, your neutral stimulus, with turning off the lights, which causes your pupils to dilate the unconditioned response.
So ring the bell, turn off the lights, wait a bit, turn them back on, and repeat.
Exactly. Do that a few times and you'll start to see the magic of classical conditioning at work.
What kind of magic are we talking about here?
Well, after a while, you'll notice that just the sound of the bell, even with the lights on, will cause your pupils to dilate a little.
Whoa. Seriously?
Yep. Your brain has learned to associate that bell sound with darkness. So even though you're not actually in the dark, your pupils start to react as if you were.
That's wild. I can't wait to try that out later. It's a great example of how this conditioning stuff is happening right inside our own bodies.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. This principle goes way beyond drooling dogs and dilating pupils.
So what are some other real-world examples? I'm really curious to see how this plays out in everyday life.
Well, for starters, did you know ranchers have actually been using classical conditioning to protect their sheep from predators?
Wait, really? How does that work?
They've figured out a clever way to use taste aversion to deter wolves and coyotes from attacking their sheep.
Taste aversion. So like making them dislike the taste of mutton.
Exactly. They basically give the wolves and coyotes some mutton that's been laced with a chemical that makes them feel really sick.
So the wolves eat the mutton, get sick, and then...
Their brains make this strong connection between the taste of the mutton and that terrible feeling of being sick.
It's like food poisoning, but on purpose.
Right, and it's so powerful that they actually start to avoid sheep altogether. They've developed a conditioned taste aversion.
That's pretty amazing. So they've basically trained these wild animals using classical conditioning.
Exactly. It's a pretty ingenious application of this principle, and it shows how powerful it can be.
Wow. I'm really starting to see how this goes way beyond the textbook examples.
And we're just getting started. There's a whole field called psychoneuroimmunology that's looking at the connections between our minds, our nervous systems, and our immune systems.
Okay, that sounds complicated. Break it down for me.
Well, some early research in this field suggests that we might actually be able to boost our immune response through classical conditioning.
Wait, are you saying we could potentially train our bodies to fight off illness better?
That's the idea. It's still early research, but imagine if you paired something like soothing music with a medication that boosts your immune system.
So, like every time you take your medicine, you listen to a specific song.
Exactly. Over time, your body might learn to associate that music with a stronger immune response. And eventually, the music alone might be enough to trigger that beneficial effect.
Wow. That's really mind-blowing. It's like we could hack our own immune systems.
It's a pretty exciting possibility, and it shows how this one simple principle of classical conditioning has these incredible implications for our health and well-being.
Okay. So we've seen how classical conditioning can explain everything from drooling dogs to how ranchers protect their sheep to maybe even boosting our immune systems.
But now I'm curious to explore how this principle applies to us on a more personal level. How are our everyday thoughts, feelings, and behaviors shaped by this?
That's a great question, and one we'll dive into right after the break.
All right, so we've been talking about how this classical conditioning is being used in some pretty amazing ways.
Yeah, like training wolves to avoid sheep and maybe even boosting our immune systems.
But now I'm curious, how does this stuff play out in our everyday lives?
Oh, it's happening all the time, more than you probably realize. Think about it this way. Have you ever noticed how certain smells can trigger really specific memories or feelings?
Totally. Like the smell of freshly baked bread always reminds me of my grandma's kitchen.
Exactly. That smell has become a conditioned stimulus for you. It's been paired with those warm, fuzzy memories of your grandma, so now just the smell alone can evoke those feelings.
It's like I'm transported back to her kitchen in an instant.
And it's not just smells either. Think about how certain songs can trigger vivid memories or specific emotions.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's this one song that always takes me right back to my first high school dance. I can practically hear the crowd and feel the nervous excitement just from hearing the opening chords.
That's your brain making those lightning-fast connections between the song, your conditioned stimulus, and those memories and emotions, your conditioned response.
It's like our brains are these giant web of associations, constantly linking things together based on our experiences.
And those associations aren't just happening on a conscious level. They're influencing our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in all sorts of subtle ways.
It's kind of freaky when you think about it. Like, are we really just puppets to our past experiences?
It's not quite that simple. But it is true that those conditioned responses can have a powerful influence on us.
So what can we do about it? Are we just stuck with these automatic reactions?
That's the exciting part. The more we understand about how classical conditioning works, the more we can start to recognize these patterns and even rewire some of those automatic responses.
Okay, I'm definitely interested in rewiring some of my less than helpful reactions. Tell me more.
Well, think about how classical conditioning is used in advertising. Those clever marketers, they're not just trying to show you a product, they're trying to create a whole feeling or experience around that product.
Oh yeah, like those car commercials that make it look like you'll be driving off into the sunset on some epic adventure.
Exactly. They're pairing that car with images and sounds that evoke feelings of freedom, excitement, luxury, maybe even a little bit of romance. And the hope is that some of those positive emotions will rub off on the product itself.
So next time I'm shopping for a new car, I'll be on the lookout for those sneaky subconscious messages.
It's good to be aware of those tactics because they can be incredibly effective. And it's not limited to positive emotions either.
Oh, right, like those scary public service announcements that try to discourage people from smoking or texting while driving.
Exactly.
Cool.
They're using the principles of classical conditioning to create negative associations. They want you to link those behaviors with images and feelings of danger or disgust.
It's fascinating how this one principle can be used in so many different ways, for good or for bad.
And that's why understanding classical conditioning is so empowering. Once you know how it works, you can start to spot those influences in your own life and make more conscious choices about how you react.
So how do we actually do that? How do we start rewiring those automatic responses? Give us the inside scoop.
I'm happy to share some practical strategies, and we'll dive into those right after we take a quick break.
Sounds good. I'm ready to unlock the secrets of my own brain. Okay, so we've uncovered all these fascinating ways that classical conditioning is shaping our lives. But now I'm ready for the practical stuff. How can we actually use this knowledge to make positive changes?
Well, the first step is becoming more aware of those automatic reactions, those knee-jerk responses that happen without us even thinking about it.
So it's like hitting the pause button on autopilot and actually paying attention to what's going on in our minds.
Exactly. Start noticing those moments when you feel a surge of emotion or an urge to do something, and ask yourself, what triggered that? What were you thinking or feeling right before that reaction kicked in?
Okay, so let's say I notice that every time I hear my phone buzz, I get this little jolt of anxiety, even if I know it's probably just a spam message.
That's a perfect example. You've identified the trigger, the phone buzzing, and the conditioned response anxiety.
No.
Now try to dig a little deeper. What's driving that association? Is it a fear of missing out? A desire to feel connected? Or maybe something else entirely?
I never really thought about it that way, but it makes sense.
And that's the power of bringing those associations into our conscious awareness. Once we understand the underlying triggers, we can start to take control.
So how do we actually change those automatic reactions? Let's say I want to stop feeling anxious every time my phone buzzes. What can I do?
One powerful technique is called counter conditioning. Remember how we talked about pairing a neutral stimulus with a positive or negative experience to create a conditioned response? Well, you can use that same principle to change existing associations.
So instead of letting that phone buzz trigger anxiety, could I pair it with something relaxing, like taking a few deep breaths or listening to a few seconds of my favorite song?
Exactly. You're essentially creating a new, more positive association with that sound. Over time, your brain might start to link that buzz with a feeling of calmness instead of anxiety.
That's pretty amazing. It's like I can retrain my brain to react differently.
You absolutely can. And it's not just limited to simple things like phone notifications. Let's say you have a fear of public speaking. You can use counter conditioning to gradually desensitize yourself to that fear.
How would that work?
Well, instead of jumping right into giving a speech in front of a huge audience, you might start by practicing your speech alone in a mirror. Then maybe practice with a close friend or family member. Gradually increase the size of your audience as you start to feel more comfortable.
So basically baby steps, slowly building up my confidence over time.
Exactly. The key is to create a safe and controlled environment where you can challenge those old associations and create new, more positive ones.
So we've talked about counter conditioning. Are there any other strategies we can use?
Another powerful approach is called cognitive reframing. This involves challenging those negative or unhelpful thoughts that are driving those unwanted reactions.
Can you give me an example?
Let's go back to that fear of public speaking. Instead of thinking, everyone is going to judge me if I mess up, you might try reframing that thought to, I have something valuable to share, and even if I make a mistake, it's okay.
So basically changing the script in my head from negative to positive.
Exactly. It's about shifting your perspective and focusing on more empowering thoughts. It takes practice, but over time, you can actually change those automatic thought patterns.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. It's amazing to think that we have this much power over our own brains and reactions.
It all starts with that awareness. Pay attention to your thoughts, your feelings, and your behaviors. Become a curious observer of your own mind. And remember, you are not your conditioned responses. You have the power to choose how you want to respond to the world around you.
That's such an empowering message. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners out there, we hope you enjoyed this exploration of classical conditioning and that you've gained some valuable insights to apply to your own lives. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.